With me now in the studio is the former head of the Red Cross in Yemen, the mission there, Alexander Rafet. Welcome back to RT International. Good to see you. 3 strikes on civilians in 3 days. These are supposed to be targeted strikes. In your experience of having been in the country, just how much risk are civilians in right now, this many years into that conflict?
Well, let me start by saying that, of course, the pictures you have just shown are horrific, and I've been very moved by them. In the 2 years that I have been in Yemen, I have seen, unfortunately, quite a few other cases such like this one. And when you have a military operation on the scale which are taking place now in Yemen, these things unfortunately happen. And it is of utmost importance, of course, to document these cases and to bring the observations to the parties which is responsible for them. So this is what we have been doing consistently, collecting information whenever there is a violation or a potential violation, document the case. And you have mentioned that there would be an investigation. If we can feed into that investigation, that is something that we do. So I have no doubt that my colleagues now are following the case. I'm not in Yemen anymore after 2 years that I spent over there, and they are probably documenting the case or collecting information for submission of reports that will hopefully help for the future bring more care in the way operations are conducted. We have been doing this for 2 years I was there, and we are still doing it.
Yeah. Does it feel like an almost impossible task, though? Because you wrote almost a year ago quite passionately about your experience in Taiz, the difficulty of getting into certain places. Just what kind of uphill struggle is there for aid workers once they get to Yemen?
Well, you know, unfortunately, we had a tragedy 3 days ago where one of the staff of the Yemen delegation was killed in Taiz. And today I cannot help but think about him, his family and wife. And this, you know, is a stark reminder that working in Yemen remains extremely difficult. We do it under extremely difficult circumstances. In the case of Taiz, there are extremely tense, hard fighting taking place. And doing this work, documenting the cases, is something that takes a toll, and sometimes takes a toll on the lives of our colleagues.
And in terms of getting that assistance dealing with famine, dealing with diseases like cholera, when there are efforts like the Saudi blockade of the port, how much more difficult does it make getting that much-needed aid into those millions of people?
As you correctly point out, it's wider than a famine. There is a problem with the structural collapse of the system in Yemen. You have problems of water, you have problems of sanitation. We in the International Red Cross, we try to fix those problems, otherwise there would maybe not be any running water and so on anymore. So there is no doubt that what is coming into the country at the moment is not enough, and more should be done. Humanitarian aid is to a large extent allowed in, but the problem is that more is needed to ensure a decent level of life for the population. Otherwise, the country goes downhill. So this is quite clearly something, one of the messages that I've been passing. I've been going around many capitals. Today I'm in Moscow. I was in other capitals before to pass that message that more should be done to ensure that there is enough essential goods for the civilian population today in Sana'a and elsewhere.
And do you feel you're getting heard by these capitals?
For a long time, Yemen used to be not under the spotlight. And at least I feel now that the Yemen conflict is getting the attention it deserves. 1 year ago, the Secretary General of the United Nations rang the alarm bell about the famine. As I told you, we believe this is wider than a famine. This is actually a structural collapse of essential goods and services. So there is more awareness. I think this can be said.
And when it comes to phrases like the United Nations calling it the worst humanitarian crisis in modern history, now those people who sit around at the UN, all those nations, it's easy to condemn in words. It's different when it comes to action. Are you getting the humanitarian aid coming in, and is it just that it's being stopped from getting in, or do you desperately need much, much more?
More is needed. I think this is quite clear. It's not getting in enough for a combination of reasons. We shouldn't stop at simplistic sort of analysis. It's there for a combination of reasons, including the fact that shipping companies think twice as well about sending things because they can have some risk about it. But yes, the call I make today to you and to your viewers are that today in Yemen you have a very serious crisis. There is a food crisis. There is also a crisis that has led to 1 million suspected accumulated cases of cholera last year. In a matter of 6 months, it went like bushfire. In 22 years in the ICRC, I had never seen something like that. So quite clearly, yes, you have a situation which is extremely worrying.
Some of the reasons given for civilians being caught up in the airstrikes, and yes, occasionally in war, civilian casualties are unavoidable. One of the reasons given is that they're being used as human shields. From the people that you've spoken to in Yemen, do you get the impression that people there are being exploited?
This is not something that I can say on my own observations, on my own experience. Having said that, it is important to remind all the parties to the conflict of their obligations under international humanitarian law. One is to take precautions in the way they carry their attacks because they use vastly destructive forces. This is on the attacking side, I would say. Now, it's also crucially important that all those who are on the other side do not sort of place their military assets near villages and towns and so on. And we have quite often, I have to say, intervened to make sure that one particular post is not located any longer near a hospital, near a school or something like that. And I have to say that on those occasions where we intervene, we were heard. And the party did move their military asset.
Who else's pressure do you need to try and help here? Because of the phenomenal efforts that organisations like the Red Cross go to in order to try and protect, save, look after civilians in a place like Yemen, which just seems bleak no matter which way you read it. Who else are you appealing to try and put pressure to bring this long-running conflict to an end?
Well, as I said, I'm in Moscow today as a part of a world tour that I did after the end of my mission to raise awareness on the catastrophic situation that the country is going through at the moment from a humanitarian standpoint. I've spoken of the cholera, but I could also speak of a number of drugs which are missing, and we are giving some of them which I have never done in my entire ICRC career, like giving insulin and because it's not sufficient what is there, like supplying dialysis center. These are things, if you don't get your insulin injection or your dialysis session next week, you're not around. So you have the direct effect of the hostilities of the military operation that you spoke about at the beginning, but you also have the indirect effect, which are becoming increasingly important, increasingly worrying. And this has been my narrative in all the capitals that I have visited in the past 3 weeks.
And in terms of national or public awareness, why do you think it's fallen so far down the list for people? I mean, I follow dozens of news feeds on Twitter and what have you, and it's full of all sorts of nonsense of what's going on around the world that you wouldn't really consider important. And yet when you see anything about Yemen, they're talking biblical numbers about things that shouldn't be happening in a country in 2018.
Yes, this has been also a subject of interrogation for me because I was there and I would have liked the world to be much more aware. I suppose that other crises have caught more attention of the international public and media. This is probably one of the reasons, but now I do think that there is more awareness. When I started my mission in 2016, there was hardly anyone who really spoke about Yemen. And now, and maybe my presence today in your studio shows that there is more awareness, and I'm quite happy with this. It's not where it should be, probably, but it's more than it used to be.
In terms of wishful thinking, though, even if it all ended tomorrow, there's still a mountain of work to have to do there to bring Yemen even remotely back from the brink.
Yes, and I think you are perfectly right, and this is why I'm worried, because when the Secretary General spoke of a famine, if you bring food, it's okay. Well, you have to deal with malnutrition for a few months and so on, but here the problem is wider. The problem is one of a structural decay Yemen is not a country like you can find in other elsewhere with very little infrastructure. In Yemen, you have a lot of infrastructure, and this particular infrastructure is falling to pieces. And we at international organization, including the ICRC, we try to do what we can to support these structures. But of course, we can only do so much. So I do agree with you that bringing back the country back on its feet will be a long-lasting task.
Because that sounds like it's a technical problem that needs dealing with, that aid is somehow just a front line. It's to do with water and food, but it's not, is it? There are few doctors. The ones who are there aren't being paid. The very structures of what the country needs in order to keep rolling and keep facilitating just aren't there at the moment.
It's not only one of the most serious crises that I have seen, it's also, as you point out, one of the most complicated I have seen. And I am afraid that this is becoming a feature of some of the conflicts. You know, some of the conflict where I worked at the beginning of my career were very poor country. You know, they were poor before the war, poor during the war, and unfortunately poor after the war, very little infrastructure. So in a way, very little to reconstruct. And the problem was relatively, should I say, simple. To deal with. Here you have something which is extremely complex. You have infrastructures which are falling to pieces, up to the point that on the health system we have commissioned a study from a well-known British school that's going to carry out a full study of the health system in Yemen to know where we are.
Well, one day maybe we'll be talking here again about the rebuilding of Yemen in better circumstances. I fear it might be a long way off, but thanks very much for sharing your experiences over the past couple of years of running the Red Cross in Yemen. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.